Forget the shining armor and gallant knights of fairy tales. Picture this. You wake to a horn's wail, your body aching on frozen mud, chain mail biting your skin like a jealous lover. It's dawn, and death is already in the air. This is no Hollywood battle, no choreographed clash with heroic fanfare. This is the raw, brutal truth of a medieval battlefield, where survival hinges on luck, not glory. In 1346, at Crécy, one soldier tripped over a corpse, only to rise and slay 3 foes before an arrow found his throat. That's the chaos we're diving into. Sweat-soaked, blood-slicked, and utterly unforgiving. What was it like to face a storm of arrows, to swing a sword in a crush of screaming men, to pray your shield held against a mace's blow? Our story, rooted in chronicles and archaeological finds, strips away the myths to reveal the visceral reality of those who fought and fell. Will you brave the mud and madness with us? Step forward and let's uncover the truth of a world where every dawn could be your last. You awaken to the sound of something between a horn and a man screaming the word march, like it owes him money. There is no snooze button, no mattress. Only the damp, cold earth and the deep, spiritual ache of having slept in your armor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it. Your chainmail has become one with your body, like a clingy X. Around you, a dozen other soldiers are waking up, each with the same look of regret and trench foot. One guy is still asleep, his head resting on a helmet full of rainwater. Another is trying to pull a slug out of his boot with a dagger. You're not sure if you should eat breakfast or apologize to your organs in advance. Breakfast, by the way, is what we'd call a historically significant disappointment. It's a crust of bread so hard it could deflect arrows, possibly made last Lent. You chew slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because your jaw is still sore from yesterday's feast, which included meat of questionable origin and something that may have once been a vegetable. You wash it down with warm ale because medieval water was a game of bacterial roulette. There's no time for grooming. Not that it matters. You haven't seen your own face in weeks. And, frankly, that's for the best. You splash a handful of swamp water on your cheeks for the illusion of hygiene, then strap on gear that smells like it's been fermenting in fear. Then come the orders. Form up, move out. Yelled by someone on a horse who clearly hasn't walked a mile in his life. The army stirs. Men grumble. Armor clanks. And someone is already limping from stepping on a pointy rock while barefoot. The mud sucks at your boots like it's trying to claim your soul. You haven't even made contact with the enemy yet. And you're already exhausted, damp, hungry, and vaguely regretting your entire life. And you know what the worst part is? This is one of the good mornings. The command is given. March. And so you do. Not because you want to, but because the alternative is staying behind and getting accused of desertion, which usually ends with something being chopped off. So, you trudge forward, one squelching, miserable footstep at a time. The ground is less earth and more moist despair. Mud is a given, but this is no ordinary mud. It's the kind that sucks at your boots like it's trying to steal your soul, or at least your left foot. You stop to adjust a strap and instantly fall behind, drawing glares from the man behind you, whose face says, I will eat you if this slows me down again. Armor. It turns out, was not designed for hiking. It chafes. It pinches. And it rubs in places you didn't even know had skin. Your shoulders ache. Your thighs burn. And your inner thighs are forming an alliance against you with every clanking step. You are essentially a walking iron sausage, being slow roasted in your own sweat. The air smells like livestock, cheap onions, and fear. Someone ahead passes gas with the kind of force that suggests they lost a battle with last night's turnip stew. You try to breathe through your mouth, but immediately regret that decision too. You pass a dead hedgehog, a broken cart, and what might be a toe. No one stops. Stopping is for people who enjoy being yelled at. The sergeant yells anyway. He doesn't stop yelling. It's his entire personality now. Morale is non-existent. Some men sing war songs to cope. Others mutter prayers. One guy in the back just screams into the wind. No one stops him. Honestly, it helps. At one point, you think, maybe the enemy will surrender before we get there. Then you remember they're probably thinking the same thing, which means this is going to end with someone panicking, everyone stabbing, and you trying to remember which end of the spear goes where. After hours, a hill appears. Of course it does. Every medieval battle takes place at the top of a stupid hill. As you begin the ascent, someone slips and rolls down. No one helps. They're better off now. And still, you march. Eventually, you arrive at the place where you'll not sleep tonight. The battle camp. It's less a base of operations and more an organized outbreak. There are tents, sure, if you're nobility. The rest of you get a patch of mud, slightly less cursed than the rest. You stake your spot by collapsing on the ground and calling it a bed. Your neighbor does the same. Congratulations. You've started a trench community. The smell hits you next. A horrifying cocktail of wet wool, unwashed bodies, fermented boots, and whatever is rotting near the food cart. There's a buzz in the air, not excitement, just flies. Thousands of them. Some of them have names now. You've made peace with that. Then there's the latrine. And by latrine, we mean a shallow hole in the ground that was dug in haste and regret. Privacy? None. Smell? Biblical. You try not to look anyone in the eyes during your visit. Everyone's dignity has already fled. You're handed a bowl of stew. It's gray. That's the only flavor. Gray. You ask what's in it, and the cook makes eye contact for 5 uncomfortable seconds before walking away. You eat it anyway because you're starving, and you hope whatever meat is in there didn't have a name 2 hours ago. Some men are sharpening weapons. Others are playing dice. A few are praying very loudly, not out of devotion, but to make sure everyone sees that they're praying, just in case God's offering extra protection to the dramatic ones. Then there's the sounds. Hacking coughs, distant weeping, a man singing off-key about bread, and somewhere, someone trying to play a lute like it's a weapon. You hear a night bark an order. He's clean. He smells like lavender. You hate him instantly. Night falls. You curl up in your damp cloak, lying next to a guy who snores like he swallowed a donkey. You try to sleep, but your brain's too busy imagining all the ways you could die tomorrow. Or tonight, if that goat kicks you in the ribs again, and as you finally start to doze, a voice yells from the distance. Form up at sunrise. Fantastic. another beautiful morning awaits. Dawn breaks. And with it comes the icy realization that you're going to die in a field. Probably soon. Possibly before lunch. You haven't even brushed your teeth. Not that you have a toothbrush or any teeth worth saving. Trumpets sound. Men groan. You crawl out of your damp cocoon of lice-infested wool to find your comrades already pretending to be motivated. You line up because standing in rows makes people feel slightly more in control of impending doom. It's a lie, but it's one you can shuffle into with numb feet and questionable bowel control. And then he appears, the noble commander, a man wearing polished armor so clean it's practically glowing. He's got that energy only people who've never been punched in the face tend to have. He surveys the troops like a disappointed parent who just found out you joined the losing side in a tavern brawl. He clears his throat. Everyone braces. It begins. Men, today we fight for glory. Pause for effect. Someone near you coughs up something alive. For our king, our lands, our honor. The crowd murmurs, mostly from stomach cramps, not patriotism. Look to your brothers. Look to your steel. You glance sideways. The man next to you is visibly shaking and has his helmet on backward. His steel is bent. The enemy fears us. They probably don't. They probably have their own guy yelling the same thing in another accent. If you die today. Oh, good. The cheerful bit. You die as heroes. You suppress the urge to raise your hand and ask, can I die later? Maybe as a baker? Then comes the bit about God. God is on our side, which is reassuring. Except you're fairly sure God's been busy smiting everyone equally this season. The speech ends with a sword thrust to the sky and a mighty shout of forward. No one moves. A few guys blink. One guy sneezes. The shouting continues until someone finally shuffles forward, and the rest reluctantly follow. Not out of conviction. Mind you, mostly because standing still means the commander might single you out for a volunteer job, and you've heard what happened to the last volunteer. Thus ends the pep talk. You are now spiritually prepared to panic with a purpose. So now, it's time to form ranks, a noble phrase conjuring images of precision, discipline, and strategy. What you actually get, a very confused clump of people, vaguely facing the same direction, half of whom are still trying to put on their helmets. Some are holding weapons they just picked up 5 minutes ago. One guy is gripping a pitchfork. You're pretty sure he's just here by accident. Your sergeant, who was probably a pig farmer 3 years ago, starts barking numbers. No one knows what they mean, but everyone nods as if they understand. Front line, shield wall, he screams. Second line, pikes forward. You do as instructed, even though the guy in front of you has his shield upside down and is using it to itch his back. To your left is a guy with a spear twice his height who keeps poking people unintentionally. To your right is a man humming a battle hymn that may or may not just be Greensleeves with different lyrics. Directly behind you is someone breathing like he's been practicing dramatic dying noises in advance. You suspect he might not even be wounded, just ready. The cavalry is off to one side, horses pawing the ground dramatically, knights sitting tall and pristine in full plate armor that cost more than your entire village. They look majestic. You, meanwhile, are standing in borrowed boots and chainmail that smells like someone died in it. Probably because someone did. There's a sudden order to move forward and tighten the line. This is easier said than done when every second man is stepping on someone else's foot, and the mud is threatening to swallow small soldiers whole. Your feet slide, someone elbows you, your shield is backwards now, and you don't have the emotional energy to fix it. Then comes the drum beat, a slow, ominous thud that tells everyone it's about to start. Men start whispering prayers. One man starts quietly sobbing. You pretend not to notice, mostly because you're busy making your own peace with mortality. You take a deep breath, raise your weapon, and try not to pass out. This is it. You're ready. Well, as ready as anyone in a crooked line of terrified peasants can be. Just when the formation starts looking somewhat believable, meaning no one is actively walking in the wrong direction, the sky betrays you. It begins with a sound, a soft, distant whoosh that becomes a collective whisper of doom. Then the shouting starts. Shields up. You scramble to obey, though someone nearby is still trying to figure out which end of the shield is up. A moment later, the sky darkens, not with clouds, but with hundreds of tiny death sticks launched from the enemy's side with alarming enthusiasm. And then they fall. The arrows rain down with all the mercy of an angry god having a very bad day. The man 2 rows ahead of you drops instantly. An arrow sticking out of his shoulder like a forgotten quill. Someone screams. Someone else curses in Latin. Or maybe he was just sneezing. It's hard to tell through the panic. Here's what the movies don't show. Arrows don't glide gracefully into targets like ballerinas with sharp toes. They thud, crack, stick, and occasionally bounce off armor before embedding themselves in things not meant to be pierced, like feet, thighs, and whatever counts as emotional stability. You try to shrink behind your shield, which suddenly feels far too small and alarmingly homemade. An arrow clatters off it with a metallic clang, and you immediately decide that this shield is now your best friend. You mentally name it Gerald. You whisper promises to Gerald that if you survive, you'll never talk badly about its lopsided shape again. To your left, someone is cursing the archers. To your right, someone is being cursed, mostly because he forgot to duck. Behind you, a man is yelling that he's hit, though you strongly suspect he's just trying to get out of what's coming next. Then the second volley comes. At this point, any illusion of calm has evaporated. Veterans crouch low and mumble mantras. New recruits cry openly. One guy just lies down and pretends to be dead. Not a terrible strategy, honestly. Eventually, the sky clears. You're alive. Gerald did good. But now, the real horror begins. Close combat. Which means it's time to get very sweaty, very loud, and probably stabbed. There's no countdown, no dramatic drum roll, no theatrical charge like in the songs. One moment, you're trembling in your half-formed line, and the next, all hell breaks loose. It starts with a surge. Your side moves forward, not so much with courage as with the reluctant momentum of men who know they'll be trampled if they hesitate. Someone ahead of you yells something inspiring, promptly trips, and gets stepped on. You don't stop to help, not because you're cruel, but because you're fairly certain you'll join him if you do. And then you hit. Literally, there's a collision, You slam into another human being like a sack of potatoes colliding with a sack of potatoes wearing sharp objects. Forget fancy swordplay. This is not a dance. This is a meat blender. You swing your weapon, maybe a sword, maybe an axe, maybe just a glorified kitchen tool. You don't aim. You don't have time. You flail. You hear metal crash against metal, wood shatter, men grunt, and someone nearby repeatedly yelling like it's a war chant. The fighting is close, intimate, really. You are now deeply aware of the smell of the enemy, sweat, fear, and onions. There is no such thing as personal space. There is only panic. At one point, you stab downward and hope it wasn't your own foot. Your helmet fogs up. You can't see. You can't breathe. Someone's shoulder slams into your ribs, and you both stumble sideways, gasping. There's blood on your gauntlet. Not yours. Probably. Could be. Doesn't matter. A man swings at your head. You duck out of reflex. He hits someone else. You exchange a brief glance, half apology, half shrug. There's no time for blame. Only surviving. You try to remember your training, but it mostly consisted of swing hard and don't die. So you keep swinging, occasionally hitting, mostly missing. Every now and then, someone falls. Sometimes they scream. Sometimes they go quiet instantly. You try not to look. This isn't a movie. This is a bar fight at the world's worst tavern with 500 angry men and no one to break it up. And it's just getting started. If you thought medieval battle would sound like the elegant clash of swords and heroic trumpets, you are breathtakingly mistaken. It sounds more like a livestock market colliding with a blacksmith shop during an earthquake. The first thing you notice is the screaming. It's constant, not just from the wounded, though there are plenty of those, but from the living. Men yell to psych themselves up. They yell because they've been stabbed. They yell because someone stepped on their foot, or because they forgot whose side they're on and are now swinging wildly at anything that moves, including a bush. You've got the shrill screams of young lads who should have stayed in the bakery, guttural bellows from big men with axes, and the high-pitched, borderline apologetic whimper of a guy realizing he's wearing the wrong team's colors. Somewhere behind the lines, someone's shouting, "Hold the line," with all the hope of a man yelling at the tide to stop. No one listens. You can't even hear him. You're too busy dodging weapons and wondering if your left arm always made that clicking sound. Then come the weapons themselves. Swords clang against shields. Maces make a dull, horrifying thump when they connect with something soft, usually a face. Arrows whistle past your ears with the precise sound of regret. Occasionally, a spear cracks through armor, and the resulting shriek makes your spine reconsider its commitment to standing upright. But the worst sound? It's not the screaming. It's not even the dying. It's the wet sounds. Yes, wet. The squelch of someone stepping in something that used to be a person. The slurp of blood and mud mixing beneath your boots. The squish when someone lands badly and doesn't get up. These aren't sounds you forget. They take up permanent residence in your nightmares. You also hear armor clanking, men crying for their mothers, a horse screaming, which, by the way, is profoundly haunting. And somewhere, unbelievably, someone trying to sing a hymn, badly and out of tune. Amid it all, your ears start to ring, not from injury, just overload. You start to operate on instinct because your brain's given up and gone on break. And still, the screaming continues. If you were hoping for a cinematic, slow-motion end where you deliver a final monologue before dramatically collapsing, I regret to inform you that's not how this goes. Most people in a medieval battle died unseen, unheard, and from behind. Usually by a guy who didn't even know your name. Sometimes it was even someone on your own side. You see, the battlefield is not a polite arena. It's a sweaty, chaotic mosh pit where everyone's one sneeze away from a fatal misunderstanding. 1 minute, you're swinging your axe like you mean it. The next, thunk. Something pierces your back, and your knees betray you. You fall forward into the mud with the grace of a collapsing haystack. No one notices. No one has time. There are no final words, no hand to hold. Just you, the dirt, and the very strong suspicion that this could have been avoided if you'd become a monk then. There are those taken down by horses, not stabbed, not slashed, trampled. Nothing says ignoble death quite like becoming one with the soil beneath a panicked warhorse named Buttercup. And let's not forget the friendly fire. Not the kind with explosives, but the kind where a poorly trained militiaman swings a flail in a wide, hopeful arc and accidentally removes your ear or your head. Either way, you're remembered as that guy who stood a bit too close to Jeff. Some fall and are simply left behind, whether unconscious, injured, or just deeply committed to pretending to be dead. They lie still while boots stomp past. Some of them live, some don't. It all depends on luck, mud, and whether a looter mistakes them for actual cargo. And sometimes, it's insultingly random. A slipped foot on blood-soaked grass, a snapped ankle in a hole someone dug to poop in, or getting crushed under a panicked pile of men trying to flee, but going the same direction. In short, medieval death wasn't majestic. It was awkward, undignified, and almost always sudden. Which is why, when a man survives, he's not celebrated for his bravery, but for his sheer dumb luck. Movies make them look majestic. Galloping steeds ridden by chivalrous knights, charging nobly into battle like thunder-given legs. In reality, horses in medieval combat were less glory machines and more unpredictable battering rams with anxiety issues. When cavalry charges, you don't hear trumpets. You hear rumbling, not the poetic kind. The kind that makes your ribs vibrate and convinces your lower intestines it's time to evacuate. You glance up and see them. Enormous war horses bearing down at speeds you didn't think possible from something that eats grass for a living. The knights look impressive from afar. Shimmering armor, fluttering banners, and fancy helmets that scream. I paid extra for this. But up close, it's just screaming. From them. From the horses. From you. Because here's the thing. Horses do not care about your formations. They do not respect personal space. And they do not distinguish between enemy and guy just trying to stay alive. If you're in their way, you're going to get flattened into something archaeologists will one day label regretful smear. One man gets run over, entirely disappears beneath hooves, and is never seen again. Another tries to grab a knight's leg, misses, and is kicked in the chest so hard he might now be legally classified as a belle. Some knights fall off. A surprising number, actually. Turns out, slippery mud and full plate armor don't mix. When they crash, The sound is somewhere between a pantry collapsing and a church bell being punched. They then lie there like confused beetles, flailing and cursing as they try to stand up before someone sticks them with something pointy. And don't think the horses are immune to chaos. One rears up dramatically, gets spooked by a flag, and bolts in the wrong direction, dragging its rider toward the latrines. Another simply refuses to move at all, which results in a shouting match between knight and horse that everyone awkwardly ignores. For infantry, there's only one rule: don't be under the horse. It's a rule everyone learns quickly, often the hard way. By the end, horses are bloodied, men are scattered, and whatever formation existed is now a tragic memory. And the cavalry, they'll probably do it all again tomorrow, at some point in the battle, after the arrows, after the screaming, after you've been accidentally elbowed by at least 3 people on your own side. You fall. It might be from a shove, or tripping over a severed limb, or slipping on the world's sickest combination of blood, bile, and someone's recently spilled breakfast. Doesn't matter how it happens. You're down. And in medieval battle, falling down is not part of the choreography. It's a decision point. You now have about 3 seconds to make a very important choice. Get up and maybe die. Or stay down and maybe die. Getting up is bold, noble even, also incredibly dangerous. Because standing up in a battlefield means becoming a very obvious, very upright target in a sea of distractions. You might get speared just for trying. Worse, you might get trampled by your own side, who now view you as battlefield floor texture. On the other hand, staying down isn't exactly safe either. People fall on you, horses stomp near you, looters occasionally poke the bodies to see if they're dead or just trying really hard. And if someone figures out you're faking, they might get annoyed and fix the situation permanently. Still, many choose the dead possum method. Lie still, breathe shallow, and pray nobody steps on your spine. You listen to the chaos swirl around you. Steel hitting steel. Men crying out. The unmistakable wet splat of something ending poorly. Nearby, a man drops next to you. He doesn't move. You try not to look. And sometimes, it works. You survive by being the battlefield's most committed plank. Eventually, the fight moves on. The noise fades. And you're still breathing. Victory. Kind of. The problem is getting back up, because now you're covered in grime, blood, unclear whose, and the subtle shame of surviving by a corpse impersonation. When you do rise, assuming you're not part of a new human pile, you look around, dazed, bent, and smelling like a haunted boot. No one cheers. No one notices. You're just another body that didn't stay down, which, by medieval standards, makes you one of the lucky ones. The battle is over. You're not quite sure how it ended. There was no dramatic banner raised, no villainous general shouting, "Retreat!" as trumpets blared. One moment, it was chaos. The next, fewer screams, less clanging, more groaning. That's how you know it's done. The noise shifts from aggressive to exhausted. You look around, blinking through blood, hopefully not yours, and sweat. The field is littered with bodies, weapons, and the occasional boot that's somehow separated from its owner and is now resting politely atop a rock. It's quiet, unsettlingly so. Someone mumbles, "We won." with all the enthusiasm of a man who just found out he gets to live but only in a tent full of disease. Another guy is yelling, "Victory!" while clutching his own arm, which is no longer fully attached. You nod in agreement because, technically, yes, you are upright, breathing, and mostly unperforated. That is victory. But the truth is, in medieval warfare, victory doesn't mean fanfare. It means not being dead yet. It means dragging your bruised, aching carcass back across the field to the camp, past fallen friends and former enemies, all of whom share the same expression. Really? This is how it ends? There's no celebration, no feast. You might get half a jug of warm ale and some bread that's more weapon than food. A priest mutters prayers over the fallen. A few men search corpses for anything useful. One guy finds a decent pair of boots and declares the day a triumph. Your commander, somehow still clean, makes a speech about bravery and honor. You can't hear it. Your ears are still ringing, and your brain is busy focusing on more important things, like not collapsing. You think about the men who didn't make it. Then you think about your foot, which might be broken. Then you think about stew and immediately regret it. But you're alive, filthy, traumatized, possibly concussed, but alive, which, in medieval terms, is what they call a resounding success. You sit down on a rock, exhale, and say the same thing every survivor of every medieval battle has ever whispered under their breath. Never again. Then you get called back for another skirmish next week. After the swords are sheathed and the groaning becomes the dominant battlefield soundtrack, it's time for the least glamorous phase of combat, cleanup. You might assume this means burying the dead and tending to the wounded, and technically, that's part of it. But really, it's a mix of triage, looting, and a kind of horrifying medieval arts and crafts project where the materials are body parts. First, the medics arrive. And by medics, we mean men with knives, bad eyesight, and zero formal training. They specialize in phrases like, "That'll have to come off," and "Bite on this stick." An experienced surgeon might use wine to clean your wound. A less experienced one might drink it first. You sit down with a sword gash on your thigh and the vague hope that it's not fatal. The barber surgeon? Yes. The guy who normally trims beards takes one look and says, "We'll see." Then he pulls out a needle that's been sterilized by waving it near a candle. You do your best not to scream. You fail. Loudly. Meanwhile, bodies are being dragged into haphazard piles. Some are covered. Most aren't. You recognize a face or two, but you don't linger. The smell is turning spiritual. Flies arrive en masse, excited for the all-you-can-eat buffet. One lands on your open wound. You swat it, then realize that's probably the cleanest thing you'll experience today. Other soldiers are salvaging equipment, which is a polite word for looting. They rummage through corpses for swords, helmets, shoes, anything not nailed down or still twitching. You don't judge. You do the same. You need new boots. And Gregor doesn't need his anymore. Sorry, Gregor. Some men dig shallow graves. Others light pyres. One guy just sits quietly with a blank stare and a javelin still sticking out of his arm. You try to offer help. He declines. It's mine now, he mutters. Wounds are bandaged. Some reopen 5 minutes later. Infection? Likely. Amputation? Probable. Death? Optional, depending on how lucky you feel and whether the flies take an interest by nightfall. The battlefield has quieted. The living stumble back to camp, covered in mud, blood, and a growing suspicion that the worst is still ahead. And, technically, they're right. You've survived. Technically. You've stumbled off the battlefield with all your limbs and just enough brain function to recognize your own boots, which may or may not have belonged to someone else this morning. Now, it's time to rest. And by rest, we mean collapse somewhere vaguely dry and try not to cry. Back in camp, everything smells worse, somehow. The scent of sweat, blood, bad stew, and cooked horse lingers in the air like a curse no one's brave enough to name. You find your spot, a patch of earth less swampy than the rest, and lie down with the grace of a dropped sack of onions. Around you, wounded men groan. Some scream. One sings, badly. Another prays to at least 3 different gods, just to be safe. A soldier nearby is cleaning his blade with his shirt. He's still wearing it. The cook is ladling out what might be food. You approach and receive something in a bowl that is legally not soup, but emotionally still counts. It has the consistency of regret and the color of don't ask. You eat it. You have no shame left. That was lost somewhere between the 5th arrow volley and watching a man get slapped to death by a disoriented warhorse. You try to sleep. It doesn't work. You're too sore, too scared, and the guy next to you has started snoring with the intensity of a church organ falling down a hill. You shift positions 12 times and end up slightly wetter than when you started. You stare at the stars and wonder what you did wrong in a past life to deserve this one. Occasionally, someone limps in from the darkness, dragging a sword and muttering something about, next time. There won't be a next time. There's always a next time. Your commander walks through camp, pretending to look concerned. His armor is still polished. He's not bleeding. You hate him a little more, and yet, you're alive. Your body's one massive bruise. Your brain feels like it's been boiled in onion ale. But you made it. This is what passes for downtime in medieval war. Tomorrow, the cleanup continues. Or worse, marching again. Surviving a medieval battle doesn't earn you peace. What it does earn you is a seat around the fire. A lukewarm mug of something vaguely alcoholic, and the right to start rewriting history before your bruises even finish forming. This is how it always ends. Not with a noble ceremony or a bard singing songs of your heroism. No. It ends with a bunch of filthy, traumatized men sitting on damp logs, trying to one-up each other with stories that get more questionable by the minute. You listen as a man swears he personally took down 6 knights with nothing but a frying pan. Another claims he caught an arrow midair and threw it back. Someone else says he faced off with a war elephant in France, where there are no elephants. You nod. You sip. You lie a little too. In your version, you didn't trip over a corpse and scream. You strategically repositioned. The part where you tried to crawl into a shrub to avoid cavalry, that becomes a stealth maneuver. You skip the moment where you begged a squire to hold your hand during the arrow storm, because everyone here is doing the same thing, turning trauma into legend. It's not about ego. It's survival. If you can laugh about it, maybe it didn't scar you permanently. If you tell the story well enough, maybe it'll drown out the actual memories, the smell of burnt flesh, the look in a dying man's eyes, the sound of metal hitting bone. By now, someone's roasting a questionable piece of meat, and no one's asking questions. Laughter bubbles up, dry and slightly desperate. A man plays a lute that's missing 2 strings. The tune is off, but no one cares. A woman, a camp follower, patches a sleeve and hums like the world outside the fire's glow doesn't exist. You stare into the flames and think, I lived through it. Barely. Accidentally. Miraculously. Soon, you'll be on the road again, off to another fight, another glorious encounter. But for now, there's warmth, there's bread, there's the camaraderie of men who know exactly how much of your story is false, because theirs is too. And for one night, at least, that's enough. And so, the clash of steel and cries of battle fade into the night, leaving only stories told by firelight. But across the world, another kind of struggle was taking shape, not in the chaos of war, but in the quiet resolve of stone and earth. From the muddy fields of medieval Europe, we journey now to the windswept plains of ancient China, where kingdoms rose and fell, and a wall began to stretch across the horizon, a monument to defiance and dreams. This is the story of the Great Wall. Centuries before, the Great Wall became a continuous monument slicing across northern China. The landscape was a chaotic checkerboard of kingdoms, each with their own ambitions and anxieties. This was the Warring States period, a time of relentless conflict when 7 powerful states clawed and bled for dominance over the Chinese heartland. These kingdoms, constantly at odds with one another, had little reason to cooperate. Instead, they raised individual walls, local, makeshift defenses built from tamped earth, stones, and timber. These early fortifications were not part of some grand, unified plan. They were desperate measures, the equivalent of drawing a line in the sand and daring your rival to cross it. More than barriers, they were statements of power. This is mine. Try and take it. But it wasn't just rival kingdoms they feared. To the north, beyond the cultivated fields and river valleys, roamed nomadic tribes. The Xiongnu chief among them, skilled horsemen who moved like ghosts across the steppes, raiding and vanishing before retaliation could even be organized. These raids weren't just inconvenient. They were existential threats. Livestock stolen, villages burned, and trade routes severed. The scattered states had little choice but to try and wall off the wild. The earliest of these regional barriers stretched for miles, but they were fragile, hastily constructed with rammed earth or layers of brush and mud. Some were reinforced with wooden stakes or crude stone blocks, but few were built to last. What they lacked in permanence, they made up for in manpower. Tens of thousands of peasants, conscripts, and prisoners were thrown into the grueling work, often with no choice and no rest. These isolated walls were often poorly maintained, crumbling in the face of time and weather. Still, they represented the beginning of an idea that China's northern frontier could be tamed, not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through sheer will and wall building. No single king envisioned the Great Wall as we know it today. That dream of unification, of a singular barrier stretching across the spine of China, would come later, with the rise of an emperor who craved not just power, but eternity in stone. And so, amid dust and blood, the groundwork was laid, not for a wall, but for a legend. In 221 BCE, after centuries of chaos, a single man did what no one before him had: unite all of China. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, and he didn't just want to rule. He wanted to redefine the landscape itself. Where others saw a fractured region stitched together by war, he saw the beginnings of an empire. And to protect it, he needed something colossal. One of his first decrees as emperor was to link and expand the existing regional walls built during the Warring States period. These individual barriers, some already decaying, others barely more than glorified trenches, would be joined into a single, massive defense network to keep the nomadic Xiongnu and other northern tribes at bay. But this was no repair job. It was an engineering campaign of imperial scale. Qin's vision was not just about military defense. It was about power, unity, and control. A continuous wall symbolized not just the edge of civilization, but the edge of his personal authority. To build it, he conscripted hundreds of thousands, soldiers, peasants, prisoners, and scholars who had run afoul of the regime. Many were worked to death in remote mountain passes or scorching deserts. The wall earned a grim nickname among the people: the longest cemetery on earth. And yet, the sheer scale of the project was unlike anything the world had seen. The materials were brutal and basic: rammed earth, packed layer by layer between wooden frames. Workers stomped it down with their feet or pounded it using logs. Where stone was available, it was hauled by brute strength. Tools were primitive. The terrain was merciless. But Qin Shi Huang was relentless. He didn't just build a wall, he built roads, standardized weights and measures, even unified the written script. In his mind, all of it, the roads, the rules, the walls, was part of one project: to create order from chaos and leave behind an empire that would last forever. The original Qin wall may not have looked like the iconic stone structures we picture today, but it was the foundation. It was the beginning of a boundary that would rise, fall, and rise again through dynasty after dynasty. And next, it would pass into the hands of the Han. After the death of Qin Shi Huang and the swift collapse of the Qin dynasty, many of his sweeping reforms were rolled back, but not the wall. The Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, which rose in the Qin's wake, recognized the same eternal truth. China's northern border was never truly secure, and so, rather than abandon the project, the Han emperors doubled down, expanding, strengthening, and redefining the Great Wall. Under Emperor Wu of Han, in particular, the wall wasn't just a military barrier. It became the backbone of imperial strategy. The Han launched massive campaigns to push back the Xiongnu, those same nomadic horsemen who had terrorized the north for generations. In doing so, they extended the wall farther than ever before, into regions that would eventually serve as arteries of trade and movement for centuries. The Han didn't just rebuild the Qin walls, they adapted them. Instead of relying solely on rammed earth, They incorporated bricks, stones, and more sophisticated fortifications where the terrain allowed. Watchtowers were added at intervals, allowing soldiers to spot raiding parties from afar and light signal fires. An early warning system that let news of an attack travel hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, more than a military tool. The Han Wall became a logistical network. Garrison posts, signal towers, and supply depots turned the wall into a functional military road. Troops could move quickly, supplies could be relayed efficiently, and messages could travel with blazing speed by beacon or runner. The Great Wall had become more than a line. It was now a living system of defense. Life along the Han Wall was harsh, but not forgotten. The Empire stationed thousands of soldiers and settlers in remote forts, creating a frontier society where families, merchants, and outposts clung to imperial protection. Over time, these lonely stations became small communities, and in their shadows, cultures met. Han Chinese and nomadic tribes trading, mingling, and occasionally clashing in these dusty crossroads. By the end of the Han era, the wall had transformed into something new. Not just a line of defense, but a symbol of imperial presence in the vast northern reaches. And yet, even the mighty Han could not hold the line forever. Next came chaos, collapse, and eventually a new dynasty with a bold new style of wall building. With the fall of the Han dynasty in 220 CE, China once again unraveled into political disunity and warlordism. What had been a powerful, centralized empire splintered into rival kingdoms during the Three Kingdoms period, followed by centuries of instability. And as the emperors fell, so too did the priority of the Great Wall. Many stretches of the Han and Qin walls crumbled into dust. Neglect, erosion, and looting took their toll. Station outposts were abandoned. Watchtowers collapsed. In many regions, the wall became less a structure of defense and more a buried memory. Half swallowed by shifting sands and creeping vines, without a strong central government to maintain it, the Great Wall was simply too vast to preserve. But the threats from the north never disappeared. Nomadic powers like the Xianbei, the Rouran, and later the Turks rose and expanded across the steppes. Some of these groups would eventually carve out their own kingdoms within China, blending cultures while redefining borders. The wall, in these times, was less a hard border and more a relic of an older vision of defense, a line that no longer matched the political reality. Yet, fragments of the wall still served local rulers. Some warlords and regional dynasties used leftover segments of the ancient defenses as the skeletons for new fortifications. Others mined the old walls for materials. Bricks and stones were repurposed to build homes, temples, or regional walls of their own. It was a slow cannibalization of a fallen empire's bones. Meanwhile, in the popular imagination, the wall faded. It was no longer an empire-wide project, but a thing of legends and old records. Chinese poets wrote of distant battlegrounds and border fortresses, painting the northern frontier as a cold, bitter place where men went to die and was seldom remembered. Still, even in this time of decay, the idea of the wall remained powerful. It lingered as a symbol of what China had once been and what it could be again, a dream of unity, strength, and clarity in the face of chaos. And that dream would stir once more when a new dynasty, born from military conquest and fueled by ambition, rose from the ashes, the Ming. But first, centuries more would pass. By the time the Ming dynasty came to power in 1368, China had seen centuries of invasion, collapse, and foreign rule. The trauma of the Yuan dynasty, ruled by the Mongols, was still fresh. The Mongol armies had thundered through the north and controlled China for nearly a century. When the Ming overthrew them, it wasn't just a political victory, it was a cultural reckoning. And with that came an urgent priority: never again. The Ming emperors saw the need for a fortified northern barrier, not as symbolic, but as utterly practical. And unlike the earthen ramparts of the Qin or the decentralized garrisons of the Han, the Ming Wall would be something different entirely: stone, brick, and firepower. Construction began in earnest during the late 1400s and ramped up in the 1500s, particularly under the direction of generals like Qi Jiguang, who saw the wall not only as defense against nomadic Mongol raids, but as a means of projecting Ming control. This was a dynasty that wanted permanence, and it showed. They built with quarried stone and kiln-fired bricks. The ramparts were reinforced. Drainage systems were added. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals, and beacons were installed to send up smoke signals in daylight and flames at night. This was the version of the Great Wall that most people picture today. Massive, winding, iconic. It stretched across mountains, snaked through desert plains, and clung to cliffs like a ribbon of armor. Some parts were as wide as a modern highway. Others rose as high as a 3-story building, and all of it was meant to last. But the wall was more than just military hardware. Along its length, the Ming dynasty built garrison towns, supply depots, and troop housing, creating a parallel society of soldiers, farmers, and administrators who lived and worked in its shadow. The wall wasn't just a line between China and the barbarians. It was a lifeline for the soldiers who defended it and the empire that depended on it. Still, the Ming Wall wasn't impenetrable. The nomads adapted. Raiders found weak points. Corruption spread among guards. And when the Manchus came, they didn't charge through the wall. They were let in. But before that fall, the Ming had done the impossible. They turned a myth into stone and made the Great Wall truly great. Behind the grandeur of battlements and parapets, the Great Wall was also a place of grit, monotony, and survival for the thousands of men stationed along its vast length during the Ming dynasty. Life wasn't heroic. It was harsh, cold, and often forgotten by the empire they swore to protect. Soldiers lived in fortified barracks and garrison towns scattered along the wall's spine. These weren't elite troops in polished armor. They were conscripted farmers, criminals, and peasants, men who traded their freedom or futures for a bowl of rice, a pair of boots, and a crude bed behind stone walls. Some served voluntarily, seeking pay or honor. Others were sent as punishment, exiled to the frontier where winter bit and boredom settled like frost. Each day began with routine: patrols, drills, maintaining the wall, hauling supplies. The wall itself constantly needed care. Stones shifted, mortar cracked, watchtowers required mending. Soldiers repaired what they could with frozen hands, braving sandstorms in the west or blizzards in the north. There were no holidays, only shifts, and the distant, ever-present threat of a Mongol raid. Food was simple and often scarce: millet, beans, and salted meat. Vegetables were grown in small plots where soil allowed. If a raiding party struck a supply caravan, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean starvation. Disease was common. Morale was low. Desertion, despite the punishment of execution, wasn't unheard of. But life wasn't all bleak. Families often accompanied soldiers, creating small insular communities along the wall. Children were born in its shadow. Merchants traveled between garrisons, trading wine, cloth, and gossip. Some posts even saw cultural blending as nomadic groups and Han settlers intermingled through trade, marriage, or uneasy peace. Then, there were the beacon keepers, stationed at isolated towers far from any garrison. Their job, to watch the horizon, a column of smoke by day, a fire by night. That was the signal. Fast, simple, and terrifying. These men lived alone or in pairs, surrounded by nothing but silence and sky. To live on the Great Wall was to exist between worlds, between empire and wilderness, between myth and reality. These were the invisible lives that kept the wall standing. Not emperors, not generals, just ordinary people with calloused hands and cold feet. And yet, for all their effort, the wall could not hold forever. For centuries, the Great Wall stood as the ultimate symbol of Chinese strength. Unyielding stone against shifting sands, empire against the unknown. But walls, no matter how high or thick, are only as strong as the people guarding them. And in the 1600s, that strength cracked, not from an outside charge, but from within. By the late Ming Dynasty, corruption had spread like rot through the imperial system. Troop salaries were delayed or stolen. Supplies vanished before reaching garrisons. The once disciplined soldiers manning the wall were now underpaid, underfed, and overworked. Morale plummeted. Many garrisons turned to smuggling and local trade to survive, often working with the very steppe nomads they were supposed to repel. It was in this weakened state that the Ming faced their greatest threat yet, the Manchus, a rising power from the northeast. Unlike earlier nomadic tribes, the Manchus were organized, politically savvy, and just as determined to rule as any Chinese dynasty. They didn't need to storm the wall with fire and fury. All they needed was an open gate. That gate came in 1644, when a Ming general named Wu Sangui made a decision that would change history. Faced with a peasant rebellion that had already seized Beijing, and with his own forces outmatched, Wu opened the Shanhai Pass, one of the most critical entries through the wall, to the Manchu army. He hoped they would help suppress the rebellion. Instead, they took the capital and founded a new dynasty, the Qing. In one stroke, the Great Wall's entire purpose collapsed. It had not been conquered. It had been bypassed, betrayed by those it was meant to protect. The wall could not defend against shifting loyalties, desperation, or political convenience. Under the Qing, the Great Wall faded from strategic importance. The empire expanded deep into the north, pushing past the barrier that once marked the edge of civilization. The wall was no longer a frontier. It was a relic, a memory of a different world. And so, the Great Wall, which had taken centuries to build, was rendered obsolete in a single moment of human error. No breach, no siege, just a key in the wrong hands. But legends rarely die so easily. After the Manchus took power, and the Qing dynasty expanded China's borders well beyond the wall, the once mighty fortification began to fade, not with a crash, but with a whisper. It was no longer a military necessity. Trade routes bypassed it. New fortresses were built deeper into the frontier. The Great Wall, that colossal symbol of imperial resolve, simply became irrelevant. Without purpose, maintenance ceased. The garrisons emptied. Watchtowers were left to crumble. Local villages scavenged its bricks to build homes, wells, and pig pens. In some places, entire stretches were dismantled, stone by stone. Not out of malice, but practicality. Why quarry new material when the old wall sat unused? In deserts, sand slowly swallowed sections of it. In the mountains, roots split stones apart. Rains washed away mortar. Centuries of storms, earthquakes, and time turned once grand battlements into lopsided ridges and forgotten humps on the horizon. Travelers and poets still spoke of its grandeur, but few cared to visit. For most of the Qing dynasty, the wall was a monument to a bygone age, respected but rarely maintained. It wasn't until the 19th and early 20th centuries, as China struggled with foreign invasion, civil war, and modernization, that the wall began to re-emerge in the national consciousness. Foreigners, especially European explorers and scholars, started to arrive with wide eyes and notebooks. They romanticized it. They marveled at it. Some even misunderstood it, believing the entire structure had been built by one emperor, or that it was visible from the moon. By the time the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the wall had become more than stone. It was a symbol of Chinese identity, endurance, and ingenuity. Mao Zedong famously said, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man," turning it from a ruin into a patriotic rite of passage. In the late 20th century, restoration projects began, particularly near Beijing. Tourists flocked to sites like Battling, where the wall was reconstructed to its Ming glory. Other sections, wild, broken, and authentic, remained untouched, slowly succumbing to nature. From forgotten ruin to global icon, the Great Wall had completed a strange journey. No longer a barrier of defense, it had become a bridge to the past, a reminder of what people can build when driven by fear, ambition, and dreams that stretch across centuries. The Great Wall of China is one of the most recognized structures on Earth. Yet much of what people know about it is wrapped in myth and exaggeration. Contrary to popular belief, it's not a single wall, but a network of fortifications built by different dynasties over 2,000 years, stretching through mountains, deserts, and plains. It doesn't form an unbroken line. And no, it's not visible from the moon. But the truth is far more fascinating. The wall is less about stone and mortar, and more about memory and metaphor. It represents a civilization's long struggle to define itself, not just against outsiders, but against the chaos within. It tells a story of emperors obsessed with order, of peasants forced into backbreaking labor, of generals whose legacy was measured not in victories, but in feat of construction. It's the product of ambition so great, it left a scar visible from the sky. Throughout Chinese history, the wall has meant different things to different people. To emperors, it was a symbol of control. To soldiers, it was a prison of duty. To poets, it was a lonely place, echoing with the wind and the weight of separation. And to modern China, it has become a cultural anchor, a reminder of endurance, strength, and national pride. Tourists come by the millions, hiking restored paths and posing beside ancient watchtowers. They're drawn not just to the view, but to the myth, the idea that human hands could shape something so vast, so defiant, it would outlast kingdoms, dynasties, even time itself. And in many ways, it has. Yet, large portions of the wall remain in ruins. Over 30% has already disappeared, eroded, or dismantled. Preservation is now a race against weather, development, and neglect. The challenge today is not to build the wall, but to remember and protect what remains, to preserve a past that stretches over continents and centuries. In the end, the Great Wall was never truly about keeping enemies out. It was about drawing a line between civilization and wilderness, between empire and uncertainty, between what was known and what was feared. And in doing so, it became something greater than defense. It became legend, stone by stone, story by story. The wall still stands, not just in the hills of northern China, but in the imagination of the world. As the stones of the Great Wall stand silent, guarding the dreams of ancient empires, we leave the windswept frontiers of China and cross oceans and centuries to a new land, wild and untamed. In the heart of 19th century America, where the promise of the West beckoned, a different kind of barrier needed breaking, not one of stone, but of distance and time. This is the story of the Pony Express, where courage and hoofbeats raced against the vast unknown. The year was 1860, and America was a country on the brink of both greatness and collapse. With the rumble of civil war on the horizon and gold fever gripping California, one thing was painfully clear. The United States was growing faster than its communication lines could keep up. The East Coast was buzzing with telegraph wires and railroads. But the West, it might as well have been another continent. Sending a letter from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, could take 3 to 4 weeks on a good day. That was, of course, assuming the stagecoaches weren't held up by snow, bandits, or the casual collapse of a rickety bridge. And in a country obsessed with manifest destiny, waiting a month to hear if your shipment of gold had made it or whether Lincoln had been nominated was unacceptable. The government had tried alternatives, steamships around Cape Horn or via the Panama Isthmus, both risky, expensive, and painfully slow. But the West needed real-time updates, not news that was already outdated by the time it arrived. What the country needed was speed, and preferably something that didn't involve a 6-month cruise around South America. Enter the Pony Express, a bold, reckless, and some might say wildly impractical idea. The concept was simple. Put a chain of young, lightweight riders on horseback, racing day and night across nearly 2,000 miles of rugged terrain. Relay stations would be placed every 10 to 15 miles. Fresh horses swapped in minutes, and no one stopped. Rain, snow, or arrows be damned. Letters would now travel from Missouri to California in under 10 days. It sounded crazy, but then again, so did building a transcontinental railroad. And look how that turned out. This wasn't just about delivering mail. It was about proving that the American frontier could be conquered with grit, courage, and a lot of saddles. It was about shrinking a sprawling, chaotic country into something that felt just a little more connected. And at the center of it all stood a ragtag team of businessmen, teenage riders, and weary station masters about to make history on horseback. But as fast as it rose, the Pony Express would soon find itself racing against something it couldn't outrun: the speed of light itself. The brains behind the Pony Express weren't wild cowboys or government officials. They were businessmen, ruthless, ambitious, and maybe a little desperate. William H., Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were already knee-deep in the overland freight business, hauling everything from barrels of flour to military cannons through Indian Territory and barren plains. But contracts were drying up, and the economy was shaky. So, they did what all great capitalists do when cornered. They gambled. Their new plan: launch the fastest mail service in American history and land a juicy government deal to make it profitable. They called it the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. The newspapers and public quickly gave it a more thrilling name: the Pony Express. This wasn't just a logistical venture. It was an all-out sprint across hell. The route stretched nearly 2,000 miles, from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, cutting through the unforgiving heart of the American wilderness. There were mountain passes in the Rockies that swallowed wagon trains whole, and deserts in Nevada where horses could collapse within hours. Yet, Russell and company were convinced they could make it work. They built over 150 relay stations, hired about 80 riders, and bought 400 of the toughest, fastest ponies money could buy. Their first goal was symbolic: deliver Lincoln's inaugural address to California in record time. The plan was a PR stunt, but also a challenge to the telegraph and the stagecoach, two giants of 19th century communication. They launched the inaugural ride on April 3rd, 1860. A crowd gathered in St. Joseph to watch the first rider bolt out of town with a mail pouch slung over his saddle. Cheers erupted. A legend was born. Behind the scenes, the company was hemorrhaging money. Stations had to be manned, horses fed, riders paid, and equipment constantly replaced. But no one cared about the books yet. All eyes were on the trail. Could this audacious experiment actually work? What followed wasn't just fast. It was a blur of courage, chaos, and wild improvisation. Riders raced through blizzards, dodged ambushes, and sometimes crossed rivers still frozen over. They weren't just carrying mail. They were carrying the promise of a united country. And for a brief, shining moment, it worked. The Pony Express had one major requirement for its riders. They had to be young, really young, ideally orphans. That way, if they died on the trail, no one would complain too loudly. Charming, right? The typical rider was between 14 and 20 years old, weighing no more than 125 pounds. The lighter the boy, the faster the horse. Ads famously called for skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18. Orphans preferred. It was part job offer, part dare, and the ones who answered were a special breed. reckless, stubborn, and wired for speed. Among the most legendary was William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West icon. Though there's debate about how much he actually rode for the Express, the image of a teenage Cody charging through hostile territory with nothing but a revolver and a mail pouch helped fuel the mythos. Then, there was Pony Bob Haslam, who completed one of the longest and most dangerous rides in Express history, 120 miles through Paiute territory, with fresh arrows sticking out of his shoulder. These weren't just delivery boys. They were adrenaline junkies. Riders galloped through sleet and sandstorms, often riding day and night with little rest. They carried a mochila, a saddlebag designed to be easily tossed between horses, which held the sacred cargo, about 20 pounds of letters, tightly packed and sealed in oilskin to protect against the elements. Every second mattered. Riders changed horses roughly every 10 to 15 miles, pausing only long enough to throw the mochila over a fresh saddle and gulp some water. Each rider would cover 75 to 100 miles in a single stretch, then collapse at a home station for food and rest. And then they'd do it all over again. Dangers lurked at every turn. Bandits, wild animals, river crossings, and attacks by hostile groups defending their lands from intrusion. The Express didn't carry weapons of war, but every rider had a revolver, a knife, and a lot of nerve. They rode alone through the night, often with no company except for the sound of hooves and the wind. Despite the danger, the Pony Express rarely failed to deliver. The mail got through, almost always. And in those fleeting 18 months, these teenage daredevils became legends, living, breathing symbols of American tenacity. While the riders got the glory, it was the network of relay stations, about 157 of them, that made the Pony Express work. Without them, there would have been no heroic dashes, no 10-day record times, and certainly no letters reaching Sacramento unscathed. These stations were the unsung heroes, scattered roughly every 10 to 15 miles across deserts, plains, and mountain passes, like tiny islands of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. There were two main types: relay stations and home stations. Relay stations were simple affairs, bare-bones structures where a rider would swap out their exhausted horse for a fresh one. The exchange was a pit stop in the purest sense, often completed in under 2 minutes. Picture it: a kid, barely old enough to vote, galloping in at full speed, flinging the mochila onto a waiting saddle, and bolting off again in a cloud of dust. Home stations were spaced about every 75 to 100 miles and served as the rider's resting point. Here, the young men could eat, sleep, and attempt to recover before heading out again. These were often operated by station keepers and their families, living in isolated cabins or sod houses with little more than a fireplace and a sense of duty. Mail delivery depended on them. A missed horse, a closed gate, or a sleepy attendant could cause hours of delay, and that was unacceptable. Life at these stations wasn't glamorous. Supplies were scarce. Stations in the high desert or deep plains had to fend off raids, survive brutal winters, and deal with wildlife ranging from rattlesnakes to wolves. Station keepers often lived with a rifle within arm's reach and slept with one eye open. And yet, the system worked. Most of the time, Horses were strategically placed. Riders followed strict timetables. Each station served as a heartbeat in the grand circulatory system of the Pony Express. Miss a beat, and the whole organism suffered. But when it all clicked, it was magic. Messages that once took weeks suddenly arrived in 9 or 10 days. A letter sent from New York could pass through dozens of hands, hundreds of hooves, and across a continent's worth of peril, and still arrive ahead of schedule. The system was bold, fragile, and breathtakingly efficient. But it was also expensive. And now, it was time to pay the bill. The Pony Express was fast, blazingly, unbelievably fast for its time. But speed came at a cost, and not just in risk, sweat, or the occasional horse that dropped dead mid-route. The cost was very real, very financial, and very unsustainable. From the very beginning, the Pony Express bled money. Operating across 1,000 miles of harsh terrain required enormous resources. Just building the infrastructure, stations, barns, corrals, and supply depots, cost the founders around $200,000, a fortune in 1860. Then, there were the horses, hundreds of them, each bred for speed and endurance, not longevity. And, of course, the riders and station workers all had to be paid. Barely. Each letter cost the customer $5 for half an ounce in the beginning. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $170 today, just to send a short message. Even when the price eventually dropped to $1, it was still out of reach for most Americans. The service was used mostly for urgent government or business correspondence. Think Wall Street, not Grandma's birthday card. Despite all the daring, all the glory, the Pony Express was never a profitable enterprise. The founders, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, had banked on securing a lucrative government mail contract, but that deal never came. The U.S. Post Office was reluctant to fund what many saw as a dangerous stunt, and political instability in the lead-up to the Civil War didn't help matters. By late 1860, the financial strain became unbearable. Horses needed feeding. Stations required constant upkeep. Riders had to be replaced. And all of this was funded out of pocket. Worse, the public perception of the Express as a kind of romantic adventure masked the brutal reality. It was a logistical nightmare, running on borrowed time. Then came the knockout punch. In October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph was completed. Suddenly, a message could travel coast to coast in mere seconds. No horses, no riders, no risk, just dots and dashes over a wire. It was the future. Cold, efficient, and utterly unstoppable. 2 days after the telegraph line opened, the Pony Express shut down. 18 months. That's all it lasted. But in that short span, it became legend, and not because it made money, but because it proved something bolder, that America could outpace its obstacles. On October 24th, 1861, a tiny but deafening revolution clicked into place across America. The final link of the transcontinental telegraph was completed, connecting the East Coast with the West for the first time in history by wire. With that one moment, the very thing the Pony Express had been designed to solve, speedy cross-country communication, was rendered obsolete. Messages that once took 10 days by horse could now be transmitted in minutes. It wasn't glamorous. There were no charging stallions or heroic riders racing through blizzards. Just trained telegraph operators tapping out Morse code into buzzing machines. But it worked. And it worked better than anyone expected. For the Pony Express, it was like trying to outrun lightning. You could be the fastest courier alive, but you couldn't beat the raw efficiency of electricity traveling down a copper wire. 2 days after that telegraph line was completed, the Pony Express officially folded. No dramatic finale, no farewell ride, just silence. Ironically, the same silence left behind after the last Morse signal went out each night for Russell, Majors, and Waddell. It was financial disaster. They had poured everything into the business, hoping to secure that elusive government contract. But the government, now enamored with the telegraph, saw little use for a horse-based mail system. The company was dissolved, its assets sold off, and its founders faded into bankruptcy or obscurity. And yet, for all its speed and progress, the telegraph didn't inspire the same kind of emotional resonance. You couldn't paint it in heroic brushstrokes. There were no ballads about clicking dots and dashes. The Pony Express, despite its failure, had the better story. Its riders became legends. Their exploits were retold in dime novels, stage plays, and eventually Western films. Even Buffalo Bill, whose actual involvement with the Express was likely exaggerated, built an entire career on the back of that legend, touring the world as a symbol of Wild West courage. So, while the telegraph won the race, the Pony Express won the myth. It represented a final gasp of old world adventure before America truly became wired, mechanized, and modern. Though the Pony Express galloped into history in just 18 months, its legend would outlive its brief lifespan by more than a century. Almost immediately after its shutdown, writers, journalists, and showmen began turning it into myth, a romantic tale of danger, speed, and rugged American spirit. The truth was already impressive, but truth wasn't enough. The public wanted something larger than life, so stories began to stretch. Riders were said to outrun native raiders, leap across canyons, and survive days without water. Historians raised an eyebrow. Readers, they bought the dime novels by the wagon load. No one capitalized on this better than Buffalo Bill Cody. Though his actual time with the Pony Express remains murky, if it happened at all, Cody saw an opportunity. In his Traveling Wild West show, Cody reenacted thrilling Pony Express rides before cheering crowds in Europe and across the United States. Kids grew up idolizing the image of the lone rider braving the wilderness, a sack of urgent letters slung across his back. By the late 19th century, the Pony Express had become more than a failed mail service. It had become a national symbol of frontier bravery, of manifest destiny, of a time when a single teenager on a Mustang could carry the weight of the nation's communication on his shoulders. Towns along the original route started commemorating the stations. Statues were built, plaques were placed. In St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California, historical markers proudly declared, "Here began the Pony Express." School children were taught about the riders, like they were founding fathers on horseback. And Hollywood, of course, came galloping in. Silent films, TV shows, and westerns featured exaggerated but lovable versions of the Express, often ignoring how brutal, short-lived, and economically disastrous the real thing had been. Still, the romantic appeal endured, and maybe it's because the Pony Express tapped into something timeless. The idea that sheer determination and grit could overcome impossible odds, that youth and courage still mattered, that in the face of technology, there was still space for the human spirit to shine, if only briefly. So, even as the telegraph wires hummed overhead, and later telephone lines and satellites followed, the image of a young rider tearing across the plains never quite faded from the American imagination. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail. It delivered a myth, a blueprint, a rugged silhouette of what Americans wanted to believe about themselves. In a country stitched together by ambition and risk, it became the perfect story. Bold, brief, tragic, and full of speed. At its heart, the Pony Express captured a uniquely American fantasy that one individual with enough courage and determination could carry the burden of a vast nation on their back. A teenage rider braving storms and arrows symbolized not just frontier grit, but youthful defiance against the impossible. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about heart. As the 20th century dawned and America entered the industrial age, that cowboy on a mission energy became a kind of nostalgic fuel. Railroads might have spanned the continent, and telegraphs might have connected cities in milliseconds, but those machines lacked soul. The Pony Express was the last time communication felt human, urgent, and heroic. It was the last romantic gasp before wires and gears replaced muscle and sweat. Politically, the story of the Pony Express was also convenient. It painted the expansion westward as noble and exhilarating, rather than messy, violent, or exploitative. Schoolbooks taught it as a triumph of courage, not a story of risky capital investment or conflict with indigenous peoples. In this way, the Pony Express helped launder the more uncomfortable parts of American expansion into a feel-good narrative. A teenager galloping through the desert is easier to celebrate than a land dispute or a bankrupt freight company. Still, that doesn't diminish its impact. It proved that the West could be connected. That distance could be conquered. And even though the Express failed financially, it helped pave the way, literally and figuratively, for the infrastructure that would follow. The telegraph, the railroad, the transcontinental highway. In a way, the Pony Express was America's awkward teenage phase. Bold ideas, clumsy execution, high ideals, and a few broken bones along the way. It was a short-lived miracle that set the stage for something bigger. And even now, when modern communication happens with a tap, there's still something stirring about a lone horseman galloping into the unknown. Because somewhere, buried deep in the dust, is the reminder that progress once came on four legs and raw nerve. On October 26th, 1861, just 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph line went live, the last Pony Express rider galloped into Sacramento. There were no fireworks, no farewell parade, just a quiet end to one of the boldest communication experiments in American history. It was over. Just like that. But that final ride wasn't a failure. In fact, it was a victory lap. The Express had done its job. It had proven that a country as wide and wild as the United States could be connected quickly, reliably, and with human tenacity. Even though it was replaced by the flicker of telegraph signals, the Pony Express had set a standard: urgency, bravery, and daring could still matter in a world of wires and machines. In the decades that followed, the Pony Express became almost mythological. Statues of galloping riders were raised in town squares. Reenactments were performed every July. Postal stamps commemorated its brief, breathless run. And historians, sometimes amused, sometimes in awe, continued to revisit those 18 months that changed how America imagined itself. It's easy to forget how fragile the whole thing was. Letters were carried in lightweight pouches that could be passed between riders in seconds. Horses were trained to run full tilt over cliffs, rivers, and mountains. Riders were barely old enough to grow a beard. There were ambushes, stampedes, and snowstorms. And still, against all odds, most of the mail made it on time. The Express also left behind something more subtle, a template for how Americans would view risk and reward. Silicon Valley founders and Wall Street gamblers often talk about Pony Express energy, bold moves made fast, with the odds stacked against you. It's still used as a metaphor for trying something insane just because it might work, even if it doesn't. Today, when you send a message across the planet in a second, it's hard to grasp what 10 days on horseback meant. But that's the point. The Pony Express isn't remembered because it lasted. It's remembered because it tried. For one brief, shining moment, a bunch of kids on horseback outran the world. And though they were eventually passed by the telegraph, the telephone, and the internet, they did what few ventures ever do. They made history. And then they became legend. And that, more than speed, is what made the Pony Express unforgettable. As the hoofbeats of the Pony Express fade into the dust of the American frontier, we turn from the rush of speed to the resonance of song. From the wide plains of the West, we travel back across time and continents to the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where a different kind of journey began, not one of mail, but of music. This is the story of the violin, an instrument that wove its voice through centuries, carrying the soul of humanity in every note. Before the violin found its place beneath the chins of concertmasters and soloists, before it filled opera houses and sonatas with aching emotion, it lived many lives under many names. Its story begins not in Italy, but far earlier, in the vast, windswept grasslands of Central Asia. Here, centuries ago, horsehair was strung across simple wooden bows to stroke the strings of instruments like the morincourt and the rebab. These early bowed instruments, used by nomadic herders, produced low, nasal tones that mimicked the human voice or the sounds of the animals they lived alongside. The idea was revolutionary, using friction rather than plucking or striking to sustain a note. It was the birth of an expressive technique that would echo across cultures. As trade routes flourished, these instruments moved westward along the Silk Road, through Persia, into the Arab world, and eventually into southern Europe. The rebab, in particular, was carried into Moorish Spain during the 8th and 9th centuries, where it mingled with local traditions. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire developed the lira, another bowed instrument that would later influence Eastern European designs. Each culture added something, a different tuning, a new shape, an extra string. These instruments didn't evolve in a straight line. They branched like a family tree. In medieval Europe, the rebab gave rise to the vielle and the fiddle. Boxy, bowed instruments held against the chest or tucked under the chin. These were the tools of wandering minstrels and church musicians, playing simple melodies in taverns, streets, and courtly halls. Their sound was raw, but intimate. Their construction basic, but clever. The bow had arrived, and with it, a new way of thinking about music, not as a sequence of short notes, but as a flowing, continuous voice. But these early fiddles were still crude compared to what was to come. Their shapes varied wildly. Their tuning was inconsistent. There was no standard form, no refined soundboard, no fingerboard optimized for agility. Still, in their wavering tones and handmade quirks, the violin's soul was beginning to stir. The concept was there. The desire for something more agile, more emotional, more human. It was just waiting for the right hands, in the right place, at the right time. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe found itself awash in new ideas about art, science, and music. Among cathedrals and courts, a quiet transformation was taking place. The rough-hewn fiddles and vielles of earlier centuries were being refined, not only in appearance, but in purpose. Instruments were no longer just for dancing or liturgical drones. They were becoming vehicles for expression. By the 15th century, bowed string instruments had become common throughout Western Europe. You could hear them in taverns, weddings, noble chambers, and theaters, but no two looked quite the same. The vielle often had 5 strings, and its shape varied wildly from maker to maker. The lira da braccio, an Italian favorite, had a broad body and flat bridge, making it. And so, our journey through the echoes of history comes to a close. But the stories we've shared today are far from mere tales. Every moment, every struggle, every triumph we've explored is rooted in the truth of the past, drawn from ancient chronicles, unearthed artifacts, and the meticulous work of modern scholars. These are not legends spun from imagination, but vivid threads woven from the fabric of human experience, preserved in the pages of primary records and the stones of archaeological sites. We invite you to keep exploring, to dive deeper into the mysteries of our shared heritage. Stay curious, stay inspired, and join us next time as we uncover more secrets from the ages. Until then, thank you for traveling with us through time.